Hello, everyone. Welcome to NYU Skirball. I'm here to represent the German department of NYU and Deutsches Haus, which I take very seriously. Tonight we host a wonderful team that we want to welcome and listen to, and I can't vouch for what these numbskulls are going to say. But I can assert my appreciation of Lubitchian comedy, which you know that one of them is in particular an expert in. And I am a near and queer friend of Slavoj, who comes equipped with a wonderful and subtle entourage of serious thinkers whom we welcome strongly. So I suppose you don't need trigger warnings, but maybe you do at this point. So there's a number of things to consider. One is that the German tradition has a deviant track that understands the subversive necessity of a certain type of humor and off-the-track kind of reflection. And I think that our team tonight might express that kind of parabasis, as we call it in the Romantic tradition of German literature and philosophy. Tonight, one of the principal addresses will be on sexual difference and its relevance in philosophical discourse, with the understanding that the United States now is in a kind of sex panic. There's a little bit of overdrive, perhaps, that we want to explore, a narcissistic surplus of our grievance culture that as intellectuals we are called upon to think about very seriously. The Slovenian incursion involves pinpointing the pricks of conscience, what Nietzsche would call the bad conscience of an era, and the pitfalls of cultural anxiety. So in a way that we welcome certain certitudes that we thought we held or understood with will be broken down with pitiless intensity. The university has been less and less capable of tolerating certain types of comedy. Comics have said that they won't, stand-up comics, that they won't come to universities anymore. So let's be aware of that, and let's be aware also that, like the police, there is an intolerance to the subversive undertow of comedy, and see what we think about that today. I'm referring to the wonderful work of Alenka Zupančič and also Mladen Dolar, their work on opera and comedy in ways that we've already familiarized ourselves with and are working with. My only complaint that I just pitched in the beginning is that one of them thinks they have gone beyond Derrida. Excuse me. So welcome our wonderful team that begins with Slavoj Žižek. Are you coming? Yes. Alenka and Mladen.
I didn't get it what it meant that we are the pricks of consciousness, like erected pricks or what, but Mladen begins, yes.
All right, I'll start. Alenka And go second, Slavoj in the end, big finale. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for this event. I would like to thank NYU, the Skirbel Center. We are really very happy and honored to be here. So now, the politics of sexual difference is the general framework title for this talk. And let me start this way. You know Heidegger's word Gelassenheit. And to make it short, let be is the ethics of letting be. And it's translated into English as releasement, or the availability before what is, this is a quote, which permits us to let things be in whatever may be their uncertainty and their mystery. Well, nobody in human history has ever stepped forward and proposed Gelassenheit in sexual matters. Like the way that the sexual matters are arranged is just fine, let it be. There has always been a very quick slide from Heidegger to Lenin, to the Leninist question, what is to be done? What is to be done with sex? You cannot just let it be. Something needs to be done. So the very question of sex always calls for social action, for a certain politics in the widest sense of the word. Something has to be done, but what? Well, in principle, there are three options. The first option, the traditional and conservative one, treats sex as something unruly, dangerous, the animal part in us, a threat. So this then calls for restriction, containment. One needs to canalize it, codify it, present the acceptable forms of sexual behavior, prescribe the right persons that can be involved, prescribe the right legal framework, the right time and place, the admissible practices and ways. There has to be a constraint. There have to be prohibitions and prescriptions. And this can be played out in a vast variety of ways. And the second attitude is the liberal one. Sex has to be emancipated, has to be liberated, given free rein and expression. One has to do away with the traditional bans, constraints that have been stifling us for millennia. This will finally make us breathe free, enjoy our sexuality. This will liberate us from guilt, from our hang-ups, inhibitions. When I was first in Paris, and this dates me, which was in '69, I missed May '68 by 1 year, but Paris was still covered with the graffiti from '68, and I was in a group. We were put in a dorm. And the big inscription on that dorm was "Nous voulons jouir sans entrave." We want to enjoy without impediments. And that was the slogan of the moment. But what if enjoyment itself turns out to be the biggest impediment? Now, there is also a third option that would want to do away with sex altogether, to be rid of this past. Already you have a line in late Plato, in his old age, where he says, how great that I have been liberated from this nuisance and good riddance. And this attitude was not proposed merely by radical asceticism, religious orders, monks, renunciation of all worldly pleasures leading to beatitude. Curiously, there were also some reflections about this in the aftermath of the October Revolution, in that great laboratory of radical ideas and proposals. And of course, the majority of reflections went in the direction of liberating sexuality. But some proposed the idea of the new man who would be liberated from sexuality altogether, like the utopia. Look at, for instance, at Platonov. And then there are prospects, specters of this, raised with our technological advancement, the possibility of procreation without sex. And Slavoj speaks about this in his newest book. He brings it up. So, what is the attitude of psychoanalysis in regard of these three options? Which politics should we espouse? Well, none of the three. But what else is there? Psychoanalysis contributed, perhaps as one of the biggest factors, to the general liberalization of sexual morals in the 20th century, to the sexual revolution, to lifting the taboos, the relative freedom of speech in sexual matters, to the point that Foucault could see as a problem precisely with this, that the proliferation of speech about sexuality instigated by psychoanalysis. So, Freud has written a paper already in 1908 entitled The Civilized Sexual Morality and the Modern Nervous Illness. And the title of this paper is the program. Psychoanalysis started with the treatment of individual patients, scrutinizing the most singular ways of enjoyment and suffering, and both intertwined, trying to alleviate their imposing symptoms, and alleviate them merely by the talking cure, as the first patient, NAO, named psychoanalysis already in 1881. So it's just words, words, words. But by 1908, Freud was perfectly aware that the problem was not with the individual sickness and pathology, that it is the society that causes this sickness, so that we have to do not with pathological individuals, but with a socially necessary form of pathology, caused by social pathology, which presents itself precisely as the civilized sexual morality, the culturelle sexual morale. So in the limit, by culture itself. And hence the title of his later work, Civilization and its Discontents, das Unbehagen in der Kultur, the necessary malaise, discomfort in culture. So the modern nervous illness is the necessary offspring of this cultural civilized sexual morality. So what is needed is not merely an individual cure or alleviation of symptoms, but a serious transformation of our sexual mores, ultimately a radical social transformation, which may look like nothing short of a revolution. And this is what places psychoanalysis largely in the leftist politics in the field of the demands for radical social transformation. In the 1930s, had Wilhelm Reich, Freud's radical pupil, who proposed the sexpol movement based on sexual politics, which presented a list of simple demands: free divorce, free contraception, free abortion, sexual education in schools, lifting the ban on homosexuality, lifting the discrimination of children born out of wedlock, free sexual life, legalizing prostitution. They're like 10 points, I think. And his idea was that if these demands were fulfilled, which seemed completely utopian at the time, then capitalism would crumble. Since what makes us into pliable, submissive subjects, willing subordinates, is the guilt produced by prohibitions weighing on our sexual lives. We are crippled by our permanent culpability. So the libidinal economy and political economy go hand in hand. And if the libidinal economy is set free from constraints, then the economic exploitation will also lose ground. People will gain the freedom to organize and fight back. And if we look at this list half a century later, then Reich's expectations seem very naive. Basically, most of the items on this list have been largely fulfilled in most of the Western countries. Of course, there are exceptions, there are backlashes, there is opposition, but the bulk of the list presents the contemporary liberal consensus. And in the country where we grew up, they are all basically fulfilled. Yet, well, the end of capitalism is not quite in sight. Well, astonishingly, these demands could be easily recuperated, and the capitalist rule actually got thereby much worse. They actually prosper within the new stage of capitalism and figure as the achievements of the Western world in relation to the retarded Third World, the yardstick of progress, and undoubtedly this is a progress. It is really astounding that such a shift could be produced in the space of a few decades, in an incredibly short time, given that at Reich's time the demands seemed impossible against the background of the ruling morals, which seemed deeply ingrained and unbeatable. But have we been set free? Now, Slavoj speaks in his book about a certain symptomatic stance of the left, which puts up a list of demands that are impossible to fulfill, knowing full well that they cannot be met, and secretly counting on the fact that they will not be met, which then allows this stance a comfortable position. With Reich's demands, rather the opposite was the case. What seemed impossible was rather quickly and relatively easily accommodated, which put us in a very uneasy, tough position. We have granted all your demands, so what more do you want? So do we still need psychoanalysis then? Well, the answer is more than ever. Now, if psychoanalysis contributed so much to the liberalization of morals, it doesn't follow that it simply espoused the liberation of sexuality as a simple solution. Freud was very skeptical about this line. He saw the problem as much more complex. And without ever advocating the conservative line, he nevertheless didn't quite buy into the rhetoric of liberation. He thought that the stakes were of a different order than this alternative, constraint versus liberation. His diagnosis was that the demise of paternal authority, of the figure of the prohibitive father, entails another predicament, and his name for it was the superego. If the traditional paternal authority was based on a prohibition of enjoyment, restraints on sexuality, then this new figure would rather enjoin enjoyment, even turn it into an injunction or imperative. Hence Lacan's proposal that the command of the superego is ultimately enjoy. And this command is like, we are Europeans, this is kind of adopted by American waiters who say, enjoy. I mean, this doesn't happen in Europe. So you're supposed to enjoy. That's what's expected of you. And Lacan put it in a very economical way with a French pun, which is père ou pire, father or worse, which means the paternal authority was bad enough with the patriarchal rule, etc. But with the lifting of this rule, we may be heading for a bigger trouble. We may be heading for worse. But there is absolutely no incitement there to go back to the good old days of fathers and prohibitions, even though they may seem like to be easier to deal with in retrospect. There is a paradox at the core of this. To follow Freud's speculations, is sexuality really restricted by something that is completely alien to it, by an external oppressor? Or does it rather form a strange kind of alliance, a compromise with what was supposed to oppress it? So we were looking at the picture from a wrong angle. And now, two quotes from Freud. These are most surprising quotes from Freud, maybe. The first one, sometimes one seems to perceive that it is not the pressure of civilization, but something in the essence of the sexual function itself, which denies us full satisfaction and urges us along other paths. This may be wrong. It's hard to decide. So this is from Unbehagen, from 1929. And this is a very strange idea. There is something in sexuality itself that resists its full satisfaction. And Freud gave voice to this idea for the first time 17 years earlier in a paper called On the Universal Tendency to Debasement in the Sphere of Love in 1912. I quote, this is the second quote, "It is my belief that however strange it may sound, we must reckon with the possibility that something in the nature of the sexual drive itself is unfavorable to the realization of complete satisfaction." Okay. So Freud, in this paper, goes on to give the humorous example of the happy relation between the drunkard and his bottle. The drunkard has no need to go to some faraway country where the wine is more expensive or where the use of alcohol is prohibited, and it seems that the relation between the drunkard and the bottle is pure harmony. The model of happy marriage. As opposed to gender trouble that we are doomed to, the trouble that may mysteriously stem from sexuality itself, not simply from its repression, from something in sexuality that resists straightforward satisfaction on its own grounds, not because of the external imposition. So that restrictions would then rather appear as an externalization or a consequence of an internal impasse, not the cause of the conflict, but rather as its result. So there is a kind of complicity, a connivance of sexuality with its restrictions. Sexuality is not simply straightforward in itself and independently of the culture that restricts it, but written with an internal impasse. It's an inherent negativity. This doesn't mean that people really enjoy being repressed, but there is something that enjoys. There's an it that enjoys. And a short sentence from Lacan, ça jouit et ça ne veut rien savoir. It enjoys and it doesn't want to know. It enjoys at our expense. It enjoys at the expense of our pleasure principle. It enjoys beyond the pleasure principle. It enjoys, but not the way we would want it to. This is, by the way, what is called symptom, and this is where psychoanalysis is usually needed. Not that enjoyment is inaccessible to us, but we get it in a way that we cannot master or control. So the stakes are much higher if we want to tackle this knot and not simply fall into the alternative of either restricting or liberating sexuality. Now, in 1905, in the 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, which is Freud's first major statement on this topic, introducing the drives, etc., well, as an aside, our friend Eric Sentner from Chicago, I was just co-teaching with him for 3 weeks in Chicago. He has a project for his next book, and we are all very envious of the title, because the title is 3 Essays on the Sexuality of Theory. I think it's good. So in the 3 essays, Freud tellingly started his argument by considering sexual aberrations, Aberrungen, and then proceeded to consider sexual Abweichungen, deviations, regarding the sexual object and the sexual goal. All kinds of sexual practices that stray away from what is regarded as normal and aimed at procreation. But then there is finally something in sexuality as such that is defined for Freud by deviation and aberration, or by declination, a clinamen from the path of natural causality and satisfaction of physiological needs. There is a deviation in the very concept of sexuality, in the very concept of the drive, which, to put it in a nutshell, cannot be grasped independently of its deviation. Now, there is a famous adage, Brecht's adage, at the end of the Threepenny Opera, which runs, "What is a bank robbery in comparison with the establishment of a bank?" Now, what are all these petty thieves in comparison with the systematic, legalized, long-term robbery accomplished by banks? And by analogy, which is a kind of strange analogy, it has limits, one could say that Freud's treatment of deviations and perversions in that book presents the following argument. What are all these perversions, deviations from the usual sexual object or goal in comparison with sexuality as such, which is in itself nothing but a massive deviation, which may be perhaps more spectacular than its perverse deviations? Aberrations and deviations are not placed in the beginning of the argument in order to lead us to the consideration of so-called normal sexuality, but in order to show that normal sexuality is itself based on an aberration or deviation. But using this analogy brings us again in a sort of analogous situation, analogous dilemma. Whose side are we on? The bankers or the robbers? Like, if cultural normative sexuality is the bank and perversions are robbers, whom do we support? Knowing full well that the bankers are actually the biggest robbers, masquerading as the respectable morals. Now, in a footnote in that book, Freud, and this is a footnote to his considerations of homosexuality, he says roughly the following. When treating homosexuality, one is usually put in a position that one has to explain it, like why this deviating behavior, where does it originate, how does it function? But then the sentence continues, in psychoanalysis, the attraction between men and women is equally in need of explanation and is not based on some chemical magnetism. So as far as I know, this is the first time that anyone has written anything like it. There were, of course, defenses of homosexuality, basically saying, but this is equally natural, while Freud's argument is, well, it's equally unnatural. The norm itself is put into the question. The bank is the robber. But this doesn't quite mean that we can simply do away with the norm. There's a certain normativity implied by sexuality itself, linked with the kernel of its own impulse. And maybe the simplest way to see this, if you consider someone like Marquis de Sade, the champion of transgression of all norms. But he badly needs norms to transgress. He needs something to be socially consecrated as sacred in order to get hold of the kicks from the sacrilege. So there may be a secret complicity between the bankers and the robbers. The latter badly need the former to have something to rob. Now, Badiou in The Theory of the Subject, 1981, made a very short programmatic statement, which seems kind of scandalous today, which is, il y a deux sexes, il y a deux classes. There are two sexes, there are two classes. Now, why is it that the left is inclined to accept the second part, but is in general completely opposed to the first one? There are two classes. This is what follows from Marx. Of course, there is a vast multiplicity of social groups, strata, social positions, identities, but at the bottom, the very way that the social space is structured is determined by the class antagonism. There is the two behind the seeming colorful diversity and multiplicity, curving and traversing the very space in which diversity is formed. So envisaging the two at the core of multiplicity, carefully disentangling how the two is at work in the midst of diversity, is the way to a politics of emancipation. But when we get to the question of sex, then the opposite seems to be the case. The assertion of the two, the very idea of sexual difference, seems to be the oppressive mode imposed on the multiplicity of sexual positions and identities, the vast diversity of practices, which would all want to be emancipated from the two, not by the two. Two invokes the accursed binarism which kept us in check through millennia. And in my initial alternative, two would be inscribed on the side of restraint and the multiple on the side of liberation. But what I guess we want to argue for is the opposite stance, namely that the two is precisely the way one should hold on to in the politics of the sexual difference. But which two? Definitely not the two of the masculine and the feminine, such as imposed by the tradition, but a two which works in them, through them, splitting them, a kernel of antagonism that they have at their core and which prevents us from ever simply inhabiting any sexual identity. Now, a child is born, and the first question is asked, is it a boy or a girl? And one decides about this by a very simple criterion, the very basic rule of thumb, the presence or absence of an atomic marker. There are some exceptions, to be sure, few, and they didn't traditionally really undermine the rule. So the phallic signifier, the phallic function, is immediately put into play. And this is what the signifier is. It's an entity entirely made up of differences and differences alone, ultimately based on a presence or an absence of a marker, of a signifying trait. And this is where the bodily contingency meets the signifying logic. But if this were all, we wouldn't need psychoanalysis. We need it precisely because the sexual difference is not a signifying difference. It cannot be spelled out or accounted for by the signifier. There is no signifier of the sexual difference. Of course, we can say a man and a woman, or find a host of metaphorical, metonymic extensions of it. But then we just turn it into another signifying difference. And Lacan has a number of notorious formulations of it. For instance, the woman doesn't exist. There is no signifier of the other, no signifier of the other, of the signifier. Or there is no sexual relationship. The difference at stake doesn't amount to a relation, be it of harmony or opposition or complementarity, the Platonic two missing halves. Or further, the sexual difference is what cannot be written. But then the sentence continues with this brilliant formulation, it doesn't cease not to be written. It doesn't cease not to be written, which means that it subtends, it haunts, it taints all signifying differences. It curves the signifying space. The sexual meaning can proliferate because the sexual has no signifier and can thus contaminate all other signifiers. Or in other words, the sexual is not a special domain that could be circumscribed and delimited, but hence it has the propensity to infect all domains. And one can see this with these numerous sexual harassment cases, how thin is the line with interpreting what is a sexual meaning or implication. It can never be quite ruled and delineated. Can one ever say, this is not sexual? We are never in a position to say, this is not sexual. And of course, this doesn't mean that there isn't a line, and certain kinds of conduct have to be unequivocally condemned. Now, how to think the two which doesn't subscribe to the traditional binary oppositions, but nevertheless holds on to the figure of the two. Sexual difference is what structurally exceeds the binary logic, but it doesn't follow that one should then espouse the multiplicity of sexual positions, identities, practices as the simple way out of the constraints of the binary mode and its strictures. Let the 100 flowers blossom, but of course let them blossom. And we fully support the move for their assertion and right. But nevertheless, and this is the big but of psychoanalysis, a but which is added to this, something gets obfuscated in this move from the traditional binary to the flourishing of multiplicity. Precisely the question of the sexual difference as the two which doesn't solidify sexual identity but disrupts them. The real kernel which we have to grapple with as sexual beings, and which cannot be resolved either by constraint or by giving free rein to sexuality. Now, coming to the end, before passing the word to Alenka just published this book, What is Sex? And I think one of the there's a wonderful way, precise way to address this problem at the minimal. She speaks at length about absence, the suppression of the binary signifier, precisely of the signifier which could, if it existed, pin down the other, the woman, etc., and the way that an excess of enjoyment of jouissance enters precisely at that point, at that spot, in the place of this minus as its manifestation. And I think that one of the greatest qualities of her book is to thwart the expectations raised by the title, What is Sex? We expect some juicy stories, the proliferation of sexual meanings, investigation of sexual conduct, social repercussions, proposal of political lines, policies, slogans. What we get instead is a very rigorous philosophical inquiry which completely disentangles the sexual from all this, in order to bring it to a very abstract core, to take all the fun out of it, as it were, and link it to some of the oldest philosophical questions such as what is one or what is being. But there is a political stance precisely in this subtraction from the usual political lines. How to cut short the proliferation of sexual meanings and bring it to the meaningless core, and how to sidestep this alternative of constraint versus liberation, and propose some hard work at the obfuscated core of this alternative, where there is no easy political proposal to follow. Thank you.
Thank you, Mladen. Thank you, Vital, and of course the organizers of this event. I will take up my 20 minutes by trying to say a couple of things about what I think is important, both conceptually and with also possible political consequences, in the precisely conceptual difference between the concept of sexual difference and, on the other hand, gender differences. So I hope I don't need to say this, but in view of what just recently happened to Judith Butler in Brazil, this burning of her effigy, being called witch and so on, I will nevertheless say that obviously there is this kind of struggle, and in this deep sense of emancipatory struggle we are on the same side. But I think this kind of rise of various fundamentalist movements, this is precisely not the moment to stop the serious intellectual conceptual debate, but precisely the moment when one should resist this move. So, okay, I will just try to address very briefly and very roughly why I think the notion of sexual difference is very significant and philosophically also extremely important, and where I see a certain problems or certain crucial things that are disappearing or not being addressed in the notion or the replacement of the sex by gender, and also in this move that Mladen referred to, from this kind of impossible binary to multiplicity. So there are, very roughly put, two ways in which gender theory, also in political terms, proposes its strategies and concepts.
One is through this more or less liberal idea of identity politics, that is, let's identify all these possible sexual identities and fight for their recognition within the social space. And then there is another, perhaps more radical and also sometimes more philosophically colored stance, which is basically a battle against precisely any sexual identities, the stance against identities as such. So I will kind of briefly say some things about both. So there is this, in this kind of a simple identity politics perspective, you have this kind of idea that the problem, and of course the repression, the discrimination related to it in sexual matters comes about all from the inability or unwillingness to recognize, to formulate and then recognize certain sexual thing as an identity in itself and attributed its rights. And I will simply remind you of a kind of I think, very obvious example why this kind of thinking falls too short. Namely, if you simply look at the history already of feminism, it has a very different story to tell. Namely, the fact that woman has always been a legitimate sexual position or identity as part of the heterosexual norm did absolutely nothing to prevent all kinds of atrocities, injustices, and discriminations being conducted against women. And we probably don't need to remind ourselves, for example, that women only got the right to vote in 1920s in the US, in 1944 in France, in 1971 in Switzerland on the federal level, and in 1984 in Liechtenstein. And one would be wrong, I think, to assume that these battles were won once and for all. And you probably also know that just recently the alt-right leader Richard Spencer openly said for the Newsweek that he was not sure that women should vote. So the fact, my point is that the fact to be a woman has always been a socially recognized sexual position, did little to protect women against harsh social discrimination based precisely on this recognized sexuality. And part of this discrimination, or the very way in which it has been carried out, has always led through definitions, images of what exactly does it mean to be a woman. These definitions and images, of course, changed in time and space, and of course this is basically what I'm really simplifying to the utmost, but this led to this idea that sexes or other genders are but cultural social constructions. And here perhaps appears the first small but in consequence important difference between psychoanalysis and cultural or gender studies. Namely, of course, psychoanalysis agrees that definitions and images of womanhood or manhood, for that matter, are constructed through culture or socially constructed. Only it adds something to this. It adds that actually culture or society itself are not simply this kind of non-problematic entities, beings, but are themselves constructed around a glitch or impossibility at their core. An impossibility or impediment that they are constantly struggling with. And in this struggle, it is also in this struggle that they produce this kind of socially problematic results. So what is this glitch in the discursive system, this gap that, according to Lacan, appears together with the discursivity as such as a kind of its inbuilt negativity, its inherent obstacle? Mladen already spoke about this, so this kind of famous claim that there is the non-existence of the binary signifier, which is a kind of a jargon that can lull you to sleep if you just speak in this way, which is probably why Lacan found another way of putting it, which certainly hasn't lulled anyone to sleep, namely these two famous formulas: there is no sexual relation and the woman does not exist. So I would just like to say a couple of words on this claim, there is no sexual relation. This famous claim is very often understood too quickly, too hastily, as basically saying something like, you know, this famous title, men are from Mars, women are from Venus, or relationship don't work. There are only series of missed encounters. There are only atomatized particles, and this is why there is no relation. So in this perspective, the non-relation is, I think, wrongly understood as a kind of ultimate truth or ultimate code of reality. So the truth is not very pleasant, but at least we know why we are where we are. I think in this understanding, so we are led to conclude that non-relation is the cause of oddities and difficulties in our relationships. It is seen as the obstacle to the formation of any successful, let's say, relationship. But Lacan's point actually is paradoxically almost the opposite. It is only the inexistence of the relation that opens up the space for relationships and ties as we know them. In Lacan's words, this is a quote, "The absence of the relation does, of course, not prevent the tie, la liaison. Far from it, it dictates its conditions." So you see, this is a very different claim. The non-relation dictates the conditions of what ties us and in what way it ties us, which is to say that it is not a simple indifferent absence, but an absence that curves and determines the structure with which it appears. The non-relation is not the opposite of the relationship, it is the inherent logic or illogic of the relationships that are very much possible in existing. It is not existing or being somewhere outside of these relationships. So I think this is a very important point to have in mind, that there is this kind of idea that culture and society and its norms are not simply symbolic sources of repression conducted against real bodies in their heterogeneity, but they are themselves haunted by a real that bars them from within. It's kind of impediment on the impossibility. And one way of formulating what does it mean there is no sexual relation would simply be to say that there is no sexual binary that exists anywhere in nature or society. And this is also, there is this famous Lacanian thesis according to which, from the television, the famous text where he says that it is not so simple, and this is what Mladen talked about, as to say that culture, society, power are kind of causing the repression. They are themselves formations built of repression. They have in themselves already this gap of repression of the unconscious. So I think basically the point I'm trying to make is simply that whenever discrimination, repression, suppression occur, they are not simply performed by social structures on the subject as means of controlling them, but are also means of dealing and finding a solution for the structural impasse impossibility of these structures themselves. And I think this is precisely where we can perhaps find a way of subverting them, because they are not unproblematic. Where there is all this massive controlling or whatever of sexuality, you can be sure that there is a massive problem of the structure which does it itself. Not simply its power, but also its impotence. Okay, now I have this kind of a very short comparison where I think one can show what is the difference, the conceptual difference between like gender theory and theory of sexual difference. And I would like just briefly consider this still within this identity recognition politics, what is usually resumed on the way when it is presented through kind of this kind of multiple letterings such as LGBTQ+, and of course some longer versions of it. What are genders that appear here? What are genders as different from sexes in these kind of formulations? They are seen as ways in which we construct our sexuality in relation to the sexual division or difference, which in turn is often reduced to a merely biological or anatomical division. This is very often paradoxical, retrospective naturalization of masculinity and femininity that then appears then sometimes within the definitions of genders, like there is this masculinity that is half femininity. I mean, all of the sudden, these two terms appear as self-evident or simply biological, which of course is the furthest possible from how psychoanalysis conceives of them. So the problem, or perhaps the way to point out this difference that I want to point out in relationship to this kind of approach, one example, I'm not saying that this is the best theoretical example, it's simply taken from a web page containing, as they call it, this is the title, Comprehensive List of LGBTQ plus vocabulary definitions. And what we read there, for example, is like, this is a quote, "We, that is the creators of this web page, are constantly honing and adjusting language to our humble goal, have the definitions resonate with at least 51 out of 100 people who use the words. Identity terms are tricky, and trying to write a description that works perfectly for everyone using that label simply isn't possible," end of quote. So what I found problematic here is that language is understood and used simply as a tool with which we try to fit some reality. And of course, the problem is not simply that this reality is already constituted through language, but also what I was trying to say before, that language itself is not so much constituted as like impeded by or traversed by a certain sexual impasse, without any sexual meaning, but an impasse of the language itself that is itself the very birthing place of all sexual impasses and meanings. This at least is a fundamental Freudo-Lacanian lesson. Sex is not some realm or substance to be talked about, it is the inherent contradiction of speech, twisting its tongue, so to say. Which is why we can cover sex with as many identities we like, the problem will not go away. So sex as this kind of impossibility, division, or if you want, sex struggle or non-relation, is often precisely sealed off when sex is replaced by gender or multiplicity of gender identities. Yes, I claim this impossibility keeps returning precisely in the form of the plus at the end. Or perhaps I would put it like this, sex or sexual difference as understood by psychoanalysis is always in the plus. Not because it eludes any positive symbolic grasp or identity, but because sex is where the symbolic stumbles against its own lack of identity, its own impasse and impossibility. And perhaps the shortest writing of this LBTG plus would be simply M plus. I mean, it's already there that starts. So I think for me can be said, or what is clear from this kind of formula, LBTG plus, is that identities are formed by way of externalizing the difference that always starts by barring them from within. This is perhaps more accurate perception of this, that simply this kind of understanding that we are simply open to new identities that will come. It is more than when a new identity is formed or recognized and hence a new letter added, it just pushes the plus as the marker of difference, or the problem, if you want, a little bit further. The difference that is being thus repeated and externalized is, I claim, one and the same difference. And this is the difference that makes a difference. And I also would say this is the meaning of sexual difference, not difference between, I don't know, men and women. Sexuation is the difference in its pure state in this sense. There may be many genders, but there is only singular sexual difference that is repeated with them and expulsed or pushed forward when they are constituted as identities. But importantly, I am not saying that the difference between men and women is repeated in the constitution of these identities. No, I'm saying that what is repeated with them is precisely the impossibility of this difference to function in the symbolic and in the real. Precisely the impossibility of sexually binary is what is repeated with here, which is, or what Lacan would call the real of sex. So I will now just, to conclude briefly, return to the question of, let's say, emancipation that I started with, or emancipatory politics. Perhaps we could roughly kind of identify 3 strategies or positions. This one that I'm kind of defending the concept of sexual difference as a different kind of difference, that is to say precisely a difference that is not simply a difference between multiple elements that exist in a certain space, but a difference that in a certain sense curves this very space within which these elements appear. It makes it not some kind of a neutral space, but precisely introduces this kind of curving and asymmetry. And also this is, of course, this kind of other kind of difference that also Slavoj spoke about in his books in relationship to the question of the class struggle in Marx and classes, which also are not, class struggle is not simply a struggle between positive classes existing in the society, but the very structuring of the social space that structures them in this way. This is very, so it's kind of a similar structure. Okay, so this is the different kind of difference. Then the second position, this identity politics that I've already spoken about, it is to say the kind of impulsion to formulate as many sexual identities as possible and fighting for their recognition. And then this third position, which would be struggle against all sexual identities, identities as such, an active attempt to blur and undermine the differences as distinctions constitutive of these identities. So I've already addressed this second position, and the kind of a problem that I see in this third position, also in relationship to psychoanalysis, is I would say that it kind of keeps crashing against an open door. I mean, Freud's fundamental insight was precisely, and Mladen spoke about this, that sexuality is something inherently disruptive rather than constructive of identities. That sexual identity is a contradiction in terms, so to say. Sexual difference also, as Lacan conceives it, is precisely not about sexual identities. It's not between feminine and masculine genders, but precisely about how the impossibility of this binary kind of splits in two and in this sense also curves this space. So sexual identities are already disrupted. I don't think that the problem is that we need to disrupt them. They're already disrupted at their core, and this is precisely the problem. And this doesn't seem to help us. So it's, and again, it is also very fashionable sometimes today to simply repeat how, for instance, sex is simply overrated and overemphasized, and how this is in fact also responsible for our social enslavement. So the sex and its importance are responsible for many of our miseries. We are all tired of it, so let's finally simply switch to something else, declare it unimportant, insignificant, and perhaps denounce Freud's so-called pansexualism, a straw man or straw concept if there ever was one. Freud was the first to say that sex is responsible for many of our miseries, exploited also in this sense, very much at work in our discontent in civilization, only he didn't think the solution was to look the other way. He didn't believe that if we simply ceased to talk about it and talked about other things instead, its ravages and difficulties will not find their way into these things, twisting and complicating them. And just as an example of what I have in mind here, I like to use this joke, which is not a sexual joke, but the structure is very similar. You know, there is a joke from the times of the apartheid, where this violent fight starts on a bus between black people sitting in the back and white people sitting in front. So the driver stops the bus, makes everybody get out, lines them up in front of the bus and yells at them, "Stop this fight immediately. As far as I'm concerned, you are all green. Now those of the lighter shade of green, please get out on the bus in front, and those of the darker shade at the back." So I think this is what I'm trying to say, that what also this joke kind of exposes, this danger, how certain kind of neutralization, which sometimes I think it's also at stake in these kind of attempts to kind of simply formulate a third sex, which would be neuter and so on, could be rather ineffective in stopping the perpetuation of certain kind of discrimination. If we, I claim, forget or decide to let go of the concept of sexual difference in this radical sense of the term, we risk ending up like the passengers of the bus from this joke, declared non-sexual yet continued to be discriminated on the basis of sexuality only like kind of an inaccessible way. So now I will really conclude. I want just to say one more thing, namely that I think that a genuine emancipatory movement is of course never simply about recognition or acceptance of differences or different identities, but about making these differences insignificant. To speak, for example, of the right to vote is to speak about the right to vote regardless of our differences. In this sense, emancipatory movement of inclusion or universality implies a severance of the links with one's constituted identities. Yet the path to this does not lead, I claim, via neutralization, but precisely via mobilization of this radical difference, of this absolute difference, the difference that makes a difference, that is precisely of the other kind of difference. And there is no emancipatory struggle that can work without mobilizing this difference. And this is also where there are these splits. And it mobilizes it as sameness. Okay, I don't have the time here to go into this Lacanian theory of how the real and is precisely the same, but I will just take recourse to an idiom that kind of, I think, efficiently conveys this when we say, for instance, I know, men, women, same difference. And I think this needs to be taken quite literally. We could also say, I don't know, gay, transsexual, same difference. Quite literally in the sense, not that we are all the same, but that the impasse is the same, and precisely this is what can finally unite us in a certain fight and not divide us. Okay, thank you very much.
What I will have to say is just variations on what was already said. I would like to begin with reference to a recent film, Blade Runner 49. I don't like the film too much, but it has some interesting points. For example, the way it deals, you will immediately know what I'm talking about if you saw the movie, with the antagonism that cuts across the ruling elite itself in our global capitalism. The antagonism between state and its oppressive mechanisms, its apparatuses personified in the film by Joshi, the boss of LAPD police, played by Robin Wright, and big corporations, personified by Wallace, the boss of Wallace Corporation. Although Wallace is a real human, he already acts as inhuman, an android blinded by excessive desire, while Joshi stands for apartheid, for the strict separation of humans and replicants. Or to quote her, there is an order to things. The world is built on a wall that separates kinds. Tell either side there is no wall, you've brought war or slaughter. End of quote. Her standpoint is that if this separation is not upheld, again, there is war and disintegration. But should we not supplement this position with the famous description from the Communist Manifesto, adding that also, quote, sexual one-sidedness and narrow-mindedness become more and more impossible. That also in the domain of sexual practices, all that is solid melts into air, all that is holy is profaned, so that capitalism tends to replace the standard normative heterosexuality with a proliferation of unstable shifting identities or orientations. Today's celebration of minorities and marginals is the predominant majority position. Even alt-rightists who complain about the terror of political correctness present themselves as protectors of an endangered minority. Or take those critics of patriarchy who attack it as if it is still a hegemonic position, ignoring what we can read already in the first chapter of the Communist Manifesto. Quote, "The bourgeoisie, wherever it has got the upper hand, has put an end to all patriarchal idyllic relations," end of quote. This simple statement is still largely ignored by those leftist cultural theorists who focus their critique on patriarchal ideology and practice. So to cut a long story short, I think that the fact that LGB was so enthusiastically supported by all those, for me, they are embodiment of evil, much more than Steve Bannon and so on, you know, Mark Zuckerberg, Tim Cook, and so on and so on. They really act as a new type of public intellectuals. All of a sudden, Mark Zuckerberg, an obscene figure for me, present himself as a potential presidential candidate, teaching us how our life should find a new purpose. This from the guy whose Facebook is the strongest machine of spending our time without any serious purpose. Another story. Okay, so this is my claim. We should always bear in mind that this tension between fixed identities and so on, and on the other hand, fluidity, reinvent yourself all the time, this division is the space of today's ideology. There is ultimately nothing transgressive in this emphasis on fluidity and so on and so on. So again, to make it very clear, I'm totally identified, I think even in the sense that Mladen and Alenka developed, with transgender people that I know. But they are not representatives of this happy fluidity. In all traumatic, painful pain that characterizes their identity, they stand for difference as such, as you would have put it. The best way maybe to put it would have been that, of this paradoxes or difference, that we have men, women, and then we have their difference as such, apart from them, as an object. Here comes my first problem with standard gender theory. Namely, my criticism of it is that the way it ideologically appropriates what's, for me, really revolutionary in transgender movement and so on. One aspect of this is which one? It's what I call playful multiplicity transgenderism, you know. Don't get too fixed, change your identity. Today you are gay, tomorrow you are bisexual, experiment with yourself, and so on and so on. That's, I think, an insult to those transgender people who really suffer. I think that here, although they claim, oh, we left behind psychoanalysis and so on, this type of playful transgender theory, where the solution is unlearn sexual difference, try cross-dressing and so on. My God, for the transgender people that I know, this is not a game. Because most of them, or many of them at least, have an identity that they did choose. But, you know, if we learn something from psychoanalysis, and from the notion of unconscious, which I claim is flatly denied by these playful transgender theorists, the fundamental, yes, we are free to choose. Yes, Lacan said long ago, sexual identity is a matter of choice, ultimately. It's not biologically determined. But it's not this playful choice, you know, I go to is it still here around the corner on McDougall down Dante's Cafe, where they had good cakes 30 years ago, you know, and it's like chocolate cake, strawberry cake. It's a choice which is the most radical free choice, which means precisely it's a choice which is always already done. You are never in a position to say, now I freely choose. It's like falling in love. Referring to your experience, if you are really in love, it's not that you look around, oh, now I'm thinking, sorry, I'm not pointing at anyone, I don't want to be arrested by politically correct police, but like, you know, you have nice legs, but you have nice smile, you have nice breasts. Oh, okay, it's you. No, the moment you do this, it's not a radical choice of love. If you're really in love, remember your experience. All of a sudden, you discover that you don't really know why, you are already in love. It's never now. You are already in love, and another catch, you don't know why. The moment you can say, I love you, although your smile is a little bit stupid, but your breasts, or your legs are okay, it's not love. So, can you imagine, I find an insult to impose this playful notion of, oh, today I'm this, tomorrow I will put brush on or lipstick and I'm something different. I mean, did these people ever meet the truly suffering transgender people? Imagine you are a man, but your symbolic unconscious choice is woman. What suffering are you ready to go through to follow your unconscious choice? So again, what I'm opposed to is this simple idea, which was referred to by both of them already, that we have some inner self which wants to express itself, its feelings. This is what bothers me also with these LGBT theorists, that ultimately their argument is, I don't feel like man or woman, I don't fit it. Well, I'm sorry, but feeling for me is not a category of truth, an authentic category. Because then you always can get a racist to strike back. I knew, unfortunately, some racists who quite genuinely, you cannot say it's not authentic, say, I'm sorry, you can convince me that blacks, Arabs are nice people, but I simply feel disgust when they are too close to me. What will you tell them? No, you don't really feel this, or what? They do. Feeling is not a category of truth. So again, this idea that we have some, you both refer to it, some naturally proliferating plurality, and then bad society from outside imposes some binary difference, thwarting your free expression, and so on and so on. What both of them already emphasize is that if psychoanalysis has any meaning, and it has more than ever today, has, meaning, a role to play, it's precisely, you both of you, I think, quoted this crucial passage from Freud, that oppression doesn't simply come from outside. Sexuality is in itself something thwarted, displaced, self-sabotaged, and so on and so on. And here, I want to praise feminine hysteria. That's how I read your M+. Because Mladen wrote, my God, we are getting old, it's almost 30, 40 years ago, a wonderful text, Beyond Interpellation, where he had this wonderful idea that Althusser is wrong, no, not simply wrong, but that, this idea of you subjectivize yourself when you assume a certain identity confirmed on you by society, like I am, man, social, whatever society interpellates you into, the identity it offers to you. But Dolar read Lacan in this sense that hysterical subjectivity, and we should here strictly oppose the 68 legacy of celebrating perversion against hysteria. This was the hidden male chauvinism of 68. The idea was hysterics are confused women, they don't know what they want, they provoke a master, but they really want a new master, and perverts go to the end. No, every power structure needs a pervert as its dark underside. But with hysteria, what's the basic hysterical question? It's the most elementary form of critique of ideology. Hysterical question is, you, big other, society, authority, you are telling me what I am, but Why am I what you are telling me that I am? This elementary doubting of one's identity. The hysterical question is addressed at herself. Am I really, okay, to quote the greatest of them all, Juliet, am I that name? That self-doubting. And, sorry? It's not, okay. Now you provoked my worst male chauvinist side. Desdemona, Juliet, the same bitch, whatever. Okay, I'm sorry, yeah. Okay, so let's go on. You see, this is where I see the problem, the path taken by some LGBTQ plus people in simply providing new, you Alenka referred to it, providing new categories. The idea is the binary opposition is too narrow, so let's try to establish a longer list. You may know that the New York City Commission on Human Rights established a list of, I think, 31 identities. Bi-gendered, cross-dresser, drag king, drag queen, third sex, allied, two-spirit, and so on and so on. And what's so interesting here are two things. First, do you know that failure to comply with this, if you refuse to respect these multiple identities, can be punished with a fine up to $250,000. I find this so ironic that the whole leftist radical protest ideology was based on this Foucauldian criticism of this strategy of power to dominate by simple classification, regulation, and so on. Now we have LGBT going to the end in this biopolitical regulation. So my ironic answer here with regard to what I think it was you, Mladen, quoted this parallel between class binary, let's call it, and sex binary. Maybe this has some use because what I'm provoked, tempted to do is to apply the same procedure of multiple exploding identities to class relations. I have, unfortunately, some people who think they are almost my friends who claim, okay, we may be rich, but we don't fit class binary, you know. So, okay, I offered them multiple identities. Let me apply to them. By class, a proletarian sub-employing other proletarians. Masturbatory cross-class. A small company self-employed owner exploiting himself. Class queen, a motherly capitalist who takes care of her workers but tolerates no trade unions. Non-class, third class, class fluid, non-binary trans class, the most beautiful one, two-spirit capitalist. I think these are people like Bill Gates, George Soros, two spirits. Half the time you speculate in the ruthless way, earning billions. The other half time you are the greatest benefactor, you give half of the, not all, billions away, and so on and so on. And then we also have the most mysterious category. Here things are becoming interesting. Every list, we learned this from Foucault himself. You remember at the beginning of his Order of Things, Foucault quotes from Borges, I think, that list classification, it's a joke, of course, of all dogs, and the last item is all, sorry? So all animals. It's not dogs. What am I doing? Okay. Unimportant details, okay. But also those dogs, whatever, who are not included into this list. What I found so interesting is that in this, and here we get the plus and the paradoxes, how in these LGBT classifications, I even located 3 elements which work like that. Because they tend to include 3 strange categories. Asexuals, those who want simply to step out. You pointed this, how, and it's a beautiful dialectic, how, no, you did not, how liberation of sexuality imperceptibly tends to turn into liberation from sexuality And I think they're basically right, in the sense that there is something in sexuality itself which resists. Liberation. Asexuals questioning a special category, like you don't know where you fit. And the most interesting one, allies. Maybe they would honor me with this title, like those unfortunately still retarded heterosexuals, but they have sympathy to us, and so on. Now, I have nothing against this. I just want to point out how they cheat here, because whatever allies is, it's not a sexual orientation. It just tends towards it. So how should we react to it? I have a very simple, radical solution here. We should accept all three terms and universalize them. First, asexual position, isn't it as a temptation, and I read also you like this, Alenka, isn't it inherent to sexual identity itself always? This temptation of, since every form of sexuality is particular, narrow, the only way to be sexual as such is to be asexual, in a way. Then questioning, as both of them pointed out, for Lacan, already for Freud, questioning your identity is not a limit to sexuality, questioning your sexual identity. It's what makes you sexualized. If you don't question your sexuality, you live in paradise. In what paradise? Oh, I advise you to read a wonderful short treatise by St. Augustine, De Nuptiis et Concupiscentia, where he approaches this stupid question, did they have sex, did they have 3 points in paradise or not? And his answer is, of course they did, but it was a simple instrumental activity, none of the thrill of sexuality, like raising your penis was the same as raising your hand to work on the field. And precisely for him, Augustine theology can often save us. His idea is an ingenious one. For an old man like me, it comes as close to truth as it can. He doesn't read sexuality as sin, but as a punishment for the sin. The original sin was eating from the apple tree of knowledge. We want to be like God. And then Augustine said, hey, I will punish you. I will punish you in what way? You want to be your master? What I can be, so to remind you that you are not even a master in your own house, I will make it so that with men there will be one organ, penis, whose movement you will not be able to control. It will raise when you don't want it to raise, when you want it to raise, it will not. So I find quite ingenious this theology, which gets late. But okay, so what I'm saying here is that the first thing to do with these classifications, which incidentally, as a practical measure, I, of course, totally support them. You can define your identity. My and our point is just you don't get rid of antagonism in this way. The illusion is that masculine, feminine, it's restraining, I don't feel it. So if we just expand the list enough, I will find my spot happily there. That's me and it will work. It doesn't. And here we come into a crucial moment pointed out by Alenka of these classifications, and I'm not criticizing it. That's the most productive part, the role of this mysterious plus. We can read this plus in a, let's call it in a nominalist way. Our classification is simply never full, and we want to be honest. As it says clearly, like, maybe we didn't cover all identities, so to keep it open for new identities, it's a plus. I think the proper way to approach it would be a paradoxical claim that plus is not just an empty space for future possible particular identities. You can be a plus also. Our name for the plus is woman, for example, he claimed. And this doesn't mean woman is less than man. If anything, it means exactly the opposite. For Lacan, subjectivity itself is hysterical. Hysteria is in search of this plus, even at a ridiculous daily feminine hysteria, which is for me, incidentally, not depreciating, but the highest elevation. Even at a stupid private level, we all remember, if you are, I'm sorry, it works with others in different way. The most annoying thing for us heterosexual men when you are in love with a woman is that sooner or later you are attacked by this question. But tell me, what do you see in me? But tell me, why do you love me? And so on. And this is precisely what defines subjectivity. Subjectivity is strictly correlative to impossibility to find a full objective correlate for you. Okay, not to go too far, just to repeat what Alenka said, I would say that in this sense, your wonderful formula, same difference. Difference about which you are talking about is not a difference between identities, men, women, their difference. It's a difference which makes incomplete, which from within destabilizes each identity itself. It's a difference that cuts from within into each identity, which is why I think we have some of us who are too heterosexual. We have this uncanny feeling when you meet a radical, suffering, transgender person. Again, he is not beyond difference in this radical sense. He is difference as such. And now just to conclude, so what should we do with regard to all these tensions? Okay, of course, we should support transgender movement, but in this sense that they don't really move beyond difference. They are the ultimate proof that difference cannot be reduced to this established gender binary opposition and so on. But there is something new happening today, and with this I would like to conclude. There is a new way exploding now of contesting the traditional form of gender identities. We see it in all media. Women massively coming out about male sexual violence. All the features of the mediatic coverage of this event should not, let's call it, Harvey Weinstein event, because I have the honor to tell you that, not with regard to my activity, but how I dress and so on, I was already called the Harvey Weinstein of philosophy. So along that line, I would say that all the mediatic stupidities should not distract us from what is really going on. Nothing less than an epochal change, a new chapter in the history of equality. Thousands of years of how relations between sexes were regulated and arranged are questioned and undermined. And nobody can say here that it's just a 1% minority. It's the majority. What is coming out is, that's another important thing, nothing new. It is something, not only in the cases we read about, Harvey Weinstein, Kevin Spacey, and so on, something that basically everybody knew about. And we were just not willing, ready to openly address the issue, ways of exploiting women sexually. Women are now bringing out the dark underside of our official claims of equality and mutual respect. And what we are discovering is, among other things, how hypocritical our fashionable critique of women's oppression in Muslim countries was and is. Of course, it's horror, what is happening there. But I'm sorry, we have our own horrors, as we are learning now. As in every upheaval, there will be numerous injustices, ironies, and so on. For example, since I love Louis C.K., I claim that what he did is lewd, obscene, embarrassing, but I'm sorry to put him, what he did, at the same level with those serial rapists brutally exploiting women, I find it a little bit obscene. But again, all this should not distract us. We should rather focus on the problems that lie ahead. Although some countries are already approaching a new post-patriarchal sexual culture, like my beloved Iceland, where 2/3 of children are already born out of wedlock, where women occupy more posts than men in public power institutions. But I think we have here 3 key tasks. First, the need to explore what we are gaining and losing in this upheaval of our inherited courtship seduction procedures. New rules will have to be established so that we will avoid a sterile culture of fear and uncertainty. Some intelligent feminists noted long ago that if we try to imagine a 100% politically correct courtship, we get uncannily close to a formal market contract. We have to. The problem is that sexuality, power, and violence are much more intimately intertwined than we may expect, so that elements of what is considered brutality can be sexualized, libidinally invested. After all, sadism and masochism are forms of sexual activity. Sexuality purified of all violence and power games can well end up getting desexualized. Now, I'm just saying that it's not as simple as, oh, now women will be more free and to write new rules. The situation is extremely complex and ambiguous. We, we behave as if we will somehow, the old game of seduction will survive and so on. I'm here much more of a pessimist. Isn't it that if you exclude those pure contractual forms of sex through ads or whatever, that in every game of courtship, I claim, there is a moment when somebody, as they say, has to make openly a move. And whatever you say, there is something brutally violent in that element. Did you see the movie by Inarritu, 21 or 24 Grams, where Sean Penn declares his love to Naomi Watts? And Naomi Watts said, how can you do this to me? Do you know how brutal is this? And can you imagine anything more brutal than somebody telling you, I totally fall for you, I desire you? This is terribly intrusive. So the situation is extremely complex here. The next task is to make it sure that the ongoing explosion will not remain limited to public life of the rich and famous, but will trickle down, penetrate daily lives of millions of ordinary, invisible individuals. That's my other great fear. It will become something for the big media, big names, but will it explode down? And the last but not least point is to explore how to link this awakening to the ongoing political and economic struggles. How to prevent this awakening from being appropriated by Western liberal ideology and neutralize it. You know, the way big corporations did it in a masterful way with much of LGBT+. You know, neutralizing it. This is maybe the crucial problem. If we don't solve this problem, this potential awakening can become just another publicity game in our late capitalist subjectivity. Thanks very much. Sorry?
Are you in the mood to talk to that?
She is asking if I'm in the mood to talk to you. My answer is absolutely not. I'm bored with you. But to cover this up, I and me have to pretend that we are nice guys. So yes, I am.
I didn't have to mime a consent culture with you, but out of politeness, I thought I would. And what we could do now is have some form of non-psychotic Q&A where you might want to make a question that's philosophically a little sound, not about your feelings because he's not into that, okay? But woman up and start articulating something, perhaps. Would someone like to start off?
Are there microphones or?
Yes, the microphones are
Yeah,
here.
because the problem is not us. I hate it when somebody talks here and all the
So
people
you can
behind
come to the
don't
mic
hear.
here, if you will.
I would like to talk about Louis C.K. And I understand what he did is, from my point of view, disgusting. But how you could actually blame him in the culture where masturbation is encouraged and porn industry has so much profit that probably other industry cannot even count on it. And how you can raise a child, a boy, how you can teach him to control himself, if what we can teach, because we don't have rules at all. What is allowed, what is not allowed, and there is no any sexual education, there is no rules in our society. They should to swim as they could, and probably Louis C.K. is as victim as these women. And why these women, будучи adult, cannot stop him? Because I am adult, and many times in my life I had some kind of experience like this. And just two phrases could stop any movement of the organ that cannot be controlled.
Thank you.
I will be very, if you want, very brief so that I don't talk too much. Usually, I agree with what you say about masturbatory culture in the sense that even, and that's Lacan's nice point, the predominant form of male sexuality is masturbatory. As Lacan puts it, sexual act from the male perspective is often masturbation with a real partner, but the structure is that of masturbation. You use the real person as just a material prop to enact your fantasy. And this is, again, nicely staged in Blade Runner 49. You remember that sex scene where his alter ego, the joy, the hologram partner is projected onto another replicant, but nonetheless a real body. I always asked myself, how did that woman, the real body, who is just occupied by this, where is her experience here and so on? How is she? So I agree with you here, but my point was much more modest, my God. My point was just that, yes, he was lewd, disgusting, but sorry, this is not the same as what, if you are to believe the media, probably we do what, I don't know, Harvey Weinstein and others are doing. And what I'm afraid is that it will get, the horror of it will get watered down into this, you see, but aren't we all obscene and so on and so on. So, okay.
Wait, are we?
Sorry?
What's the answer?
You are, but me, I'm questioning my obscenity.
What makes you think you can say you're heterosexual?
My doubt about it. I think every identity is a doubt, but now another difference, we don't have time, my God, you enter here or you. Because what we were talking about, difference and so on, and also, don't confuse this with the stupid issue of bisexuality. You know, in like, none of us is fully man or woman, we are floating, men have feminine features and vice versa and so on and so on. This is the Jungian topic, this is not what Lacan means by sexual difference, because the dream of this is precisely that somehow, first, this is absolutely part of male authority. Every big man and you can more successfully screw politically, not empirically, real women if you discover a deep feminine side in you, you know. That's part of the male chauvinist identity. This is not what we are talking about. You?
No, I mean, basically, it's also crucial, I think, in this respect, is also what you said about the true choice, which is precisely not a kind of supermarket choice of identity, but it feels like being compelled to do something, but at the same time, I think precisely in these matters, the certainty of what you are comes out precisely as uncertain. I mean, this is the two kind of collide. It's not that, okay, I'm absolutely, the very questioning of it is part of this being compelled to be it. I mean, so it's not simply this,
Hi. Thank you to the whole panel. This is a little bit of a naive question for everyone. So obviously on a theoretical level, I'm deeply sympathetic to your positions, but I guess we could say for better or for worse, the genie is out of the bottle. Like there are a multiplicity of different orientations, different identities, and you know, this does represent a kind of emancipation for a lot of people, right? And the rejection of these identities can only be experienced as a further form of oppression, correct? So if that is the case, then how do you see this notion of the ambiguous, all-inclusive plus being politically deployed while, you know, resisting capitalist recuperation as well as, you know, without refusing to recognize groups that have already been marginalized enough?
Yeah, but you know what? Only I hope you will explore this. You know that, for example, what is so fascinating with me is that women's identity can also be constructed in an extremely oppressive way. Like, and here questioning enters and so on. It's not each of us gets an identity and so on. Maybe you should go into this. You develop this much better.
No, I mean, it's also to some extent what I was quickly saying earlier, but one very simple and too brief point, way of putting it is precisely that this kind of multiplicity of existing orientations, as you put them, I think the crucial political emancipatory struggle is precisely not so much the effort of like enumerating them and kind of, in this sense, getting them recognized, but precisely what is in this difference, in these discriminated orientations that is actually common to all of them. And what is this same difference, which is not, and not only that they share, but they share it perhaps with some, I don't know, workers, or it's the problem is where is the difference that actually makes a difference in the sense that it unites us, but also makes a certain divisions which are, I mean, every political struggle divides the social space. It's not simply that we all unite. There is the enemy, so to say. But where does the line? This is, I think, the crucial question. Sometimes it gets kind of obfuscated into this kind of particularities, which who is now, also this questioning, who is now embodying the difference. This happens sometimes in a completely contingent way. There is no kind of intrinsic necessity that will put this or this. Sometimes in social space explodes because a certain contingent thing happens in a certain moment and has the power of kind of hegemonizing or embodying, at least at some point, this kind of difference. So,
and another point, sorry, very briefly, about how these identities function. For example, I totally support gay struggle, but to do this, one has to see, this was what fascinated me so much when I was, my God, it was long ago, serving the army, military. Now, how first it was the barracks where I was, a totally homophobic space. Like when somebody was discovered to be gay, he was dismissed from the army, but those couple of days before the official act of dismissing him came and he was set free, it was nightmare. You know, all these dirty military rituals. Every evening, other soldiers encircled him when he was sleeping. One put a pillow on his head, others took off their belts and beating him. But you know what fascinated me so much? that at the same time, I never lived in a social space more permitted by homosexual innuendos. Like, I remember, so it's a very interesting case of this ambiguity of sexuality. Homosexuality is absolutely prohibited, but as if this prohibition is counteracted by an explosion of kind of a fake thwarted homosexuality. For example, in my unit, the usual way to say good morning was "I'll smoke yours," which was a clear reference to homosexual fellatio, and it was even totally neutralized. It was not done with an obscene laughter. It was simply "smoke yours, yes, I'll smoke yours also," and so on. Or all this extremely stupid, like when we were waiting in line for lunch. It's so disgusting. The usual game was somebody behind you quickly stuck finger into your ass, pulled it out, then you turned around, who did it? Not me. It was, you know what? So what I'm saying is absolutely nothing against homosexuality, but how through this, that oppression is never simple. Oppression is never simple in this sense. And this is, again, what fascinated me such a lot, these complex ways, the way ideology functions, and so on and so on, no? And here, I think, I don't have time to develop it, that, as Lacan points it somewhere, if we take homosexuality in the literal sense, as denial of otherness, the other, your partner, is just a fantasy, it's just a material prop to enact your narcissistic fantasies, then, from the male perspective at least, the standard heterosexual practice is much more, in this sense only, homosexual than gay homosexuality. Gay homosexuality and, for theoretical reasons I cannot go into now, lesbianism, maybe even more, I'm not sure, is far more in this sense heterosexual, that you don't reduce the actual other to a prop to enact your fantasies. Standard heterosexuality is most homosexual in this sense. Sorry, I was too long, but now you. Mladen, why are you playing here this wise guy who says nothing and at the end you will come with some Zen Buddhist wisdom or whatever?
So we know that the true enjoyment is a delegated enjoyment. I enjoy so much if I can delegate enjoyment to you.
At my age, you tend to think the same thing about sex, you know. let others enjoy. Sorry, thanks very much. Sorry if I didn't. No, sorry, you bring, you know.
Okay, would you mind
introduce some kind of
going
justice?
next?
I don't know.
Sure. Hi. You had discussed about the internal turmoil of transgender individuals,
Yeah.
and how feeling doesn't necessarily prove the truth. So one may then think, well, how does one tell the truth? Perhaps one answer to that is you perform the truth. You then decide to don the gender you feel or don the performance that you feel is correct. But performance inherently is also something that feels very much like a lie. To most people, performance is something that you don. It is a fabrication. It is an edifice. So how can we resolve that?
I totally agree with you. Will not lose too much time, but you practically produced out of yourself Lacan's formula, truth has the structure of a fiction. In the sense that I would say, not so much lie, that performance is a fiction, and this can be a way to enact the truth. So I totally agree with you here. And this brings us to all the topic of masks and so on. I think one of the most stupid things to do is to think that, you know, when you wear a mask, the truth is your stupid face behind. No, there can be it's our everyday face which is basically a lie. And sometimes to put on a mask is the only way to get at what you, if I may use this expression, really are. But my God. Mladen.
Yes, okay.
I hate
No,
you.
I must say something, yes. Sorry. No, yes, first, of course I agree that the truth has the structure of fiction. And I mean, it doesn't mean that truth is something fictitious that one can do away with, but that truth in psychoanalysis doesn't have a structure of a proposition. It's not I mean, in the whole history of philosophy, the truth value was basically attached to propositions, a quality of a proposition which can be true or false, and then you check it against the reality. In psychoanalysis, you don't have this. The unconscious speaks always in riddles, in fragments, and you cannot, out of those riddles and out of those fragments, you cannot make a whole proposition, because the truth pertains just to it being fragmented and partial. It's form of partiality which contains the truth. It's not a proposition which you can then test against reality. So there is another kind of truth at stake, and therefore one needs structures, fictions, performance, theater, to actually come to this truth, to formulate something that cannot be actually formulated as a proposition, as a thesis. And there is more truth in the performance in this sense. And in theater, I mean, where everything is fake, everybody says the words imposed by others. Everything is rehearsed. But nevertheless, for a moment of truth to come out, it's precisely the theatrical moment, the performance is necessary. There's more truth in the performance than in the ambient realities. We are in the theater.
Just one sentence, because I think this is also crucial in Lacan. The truth is never simply the truth about the real. And the problem is not that it cannot be, the problem is that because it is too close to the real, to be this kind of a meta-statement about the real. And it cannot simply spell out the real directly. The only way it can do it is precisely through some kind of formation of truth, which is, in this sense.
If I may add another old reference that I often use, it is in this sense, you should like it, that Lacan, in a statement which I don't like its slight male chauvinist orientation, but you can universalize it, when he says somewhere that if a husband is jealous of his wife, sleeping around his jealousy is pathological, even if all his suspicions are true. What makes it pathological is not, you should not see, let's look if she is still sleeping around and so on. And I try to apply this to critique of ideology. Like if you debate with the Nazi, the totally wrong thing, let's say, anti-Semitic or other racists today, the totally wrong thing is to say, okay, these are your propositional claims about the Jews, so let's look, you see, Jews are not like that, you are wrong. No, the result would have been somewhere in between. A Nazi claims Jews are seducing our German women. Well, I hope they are, and vice versa. What can I say? The Nazis say Jews are exploiting us. Well, not all. One has to emphasize this. There was also a Jewish poverty in Germany. But you see what's wrong in this. The anti-Semitism was false, not even primarily because its propositions were false. The question is that, why did Nazis, in order to practice their identity, need a figure of the Jew? It's the question of their identity, not is it true or not. And I would even go to the end here and claim that, paradoxically, sometimes, even if propositionally your statements are true, you can nonetheless lie. Because in what you have put it, masquerade performative context, it serves some. And vice versa, the big lesson of hysteria is that lies can tell the truth more than literal truth. My God.
Okay, so we're going to have to give up soon this room. So would you agree to listening to the questions and mini interventions, and then we'll
No, I don't
respond.
agree.
You
My
don't?
idea is that I give answers, and then you should guess to what question I was answering. That would be my
I think
idea.
that's what we've been doing. Go ahead.
Excuse me, I have two questions. One is difficult and one is easy. So I'm going to list both of them,
Just
and
get
then you
to
guys.
it.
Of course. Thank you. First one, you guys all mentioned how sexuality, defies satisfactory categories, how there's always something unsatisfactory in it. And I was thinking how much of that is due to the fact that it's a violent recombination of DNA. If there's anything, if there's any biological element, how much of it which is violent and a little bit arbitrary. So, and my second
Is this a difficult or the easy question?
That's a difficult one.
Okay.
All right, the easy question is, if Louis C.K. was Mick Jagger, would he have had to do what he did?
Would he?
Would he have done what he did if he was Mick Jagger in the same situation?
If he were
Mick Jagger. Excuse me. Thank you.
All right, next.
Given the traditional heteronormative familial relationship as the dominant mode of reproduction, if the gender revolution is to seize the ideological superstructure that is the means of reproduction, what should we do after the revolution?
I thought after the reproduction. No, very good. You're digesting all this and absorbing it. Yes.
I just want to ask about the idea of feeling not being a contingency of truth, and specifically pertaining to identity. That seems like in some ways it could be interpreted as a requirement of validity. Like if you wake up and decide that you feel a way, that you're not truly that way. Like if someone feels that they're not a man, should they know it? Do they have to know it? And if they feel that, are they lying to themselves and others? Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my question is, I guess, slightly oblique to the subject matter a little bit, but it's addressed towards Alenka and something that she had said towards the beginning of your portion, which was that at this time where there's, as you called it, something like a strikingly or startling number of fundamentalist groups coming forward, that we need now not to abandon these conceptualized types of theoretical conversations. My question is as to how you, and this is for any of you really, view the mechanism by which these types of conversations would address these groups who don't, in my view, seem to exist in the realm of those types of conversations and who are much more active, or who are, the reason why it's becoming so concerning is because they're now finally organizing to do something and no longer just talking about it, I guess.
Thanks.
Yeah, no, I think perhaps there is an important question or important different, yeah, sorry.
There's Vanessa.
Yeah.
I'm interested in how authority intersects in all of this. So I'm noting in just a specific example how the hashtag #MeToo movement, where women, the voice of women is heard only insofar as they perform a certain kind of victimhood and a certain kind of a demand for paternalism. So that if I am complaining of being a victim, if I'm demanding a paternalist protection, then I can be heard. So I feel like there's a kind of a punchline waiting for a joke that I'm trying to find.
Okay, and our penultimate, because I have one.
So thank you very much for your lecture, and I would like to send the kiss, but I don't think it's appropriate. So I would like to ask a question. So I think you seem to found the identity not on the principle of enjoyment, but on the principle of suffering. However, this poses several problems.
Suffering.
Yes, so this problem, first of all, uncanny resemblance to Christian myth. So God had his own identity of God, but he became a trans God, and he became Jesus, and he suffered, and therefore he became a very important person. And the second, don't you feel like that in previous epoch, identities were based on principle of enjoyment, and enjoyment was monetized by capitalism. Don't you fear that if you will give us an identity based on suffering will also be monetized by capitalism? And what do you do with that?
Do you mean, sorry, just to make it clear,
Yeah.
I'm not answering. Do you mean by principle of enjoyment simply pleasure principle, or do you have a distinction? Because as Orthodox Lacanians, for us, everything, because for us, enjoyment is pain in pleasure. You cannot even separate enjoyment from certain type of...
I will not also answer your question, but I will say if you say that suffering is distinct from enjoyment, therefore you have this distinction in the pocket. So I'm asking not about enjoyment, even in Lacanian sense, but I'm asking about suffering as you used it.
Okay. Now, you take the purple bead and I'm going to speak.
You have like 2 minutes to answer all those questions.
I would prefer to answer in the Zen Buddhist way. Hear me clapping with one hand or all that stuff. Okay, please.
Because I will just try to pick up two questions. One I think it was the first one about, I will not address the DNA part of it, but the very expression that we were talking about sex as that what defies all categories. Yes, but there is a certain kind of problem with this formulation. I think that what we are saying, or at least I suppose so, is not that sex is this kind of thing or substance beyond reach of language or of categories. And that if we try to define it, then it simply we cannot do it. The problem is more, I think the Lacanian point is more radical. It is the very breakdown of the language. It is not something exterior to it, in where the language or these categories ran into their own impasses. There you have it, the sex. It's just this. It's not some kind of a bodily substance somewhere beyond reach. And I think this is probably this kind of counterintuitive point of this psychoanalytic theory of sex. It's not some juicy substance. It's precisely a certain impasse of the structure at the point of which appears this kind of surplus excitation, surplus bodily excitement. But okay, this is just to perhaps clarify this point. And then just this question about fight and when there are these fundamentalist causes rising, should we renounce or not to our whatever intellectual debates? I think it's always a kind of it's a choice to be made perhaps from one case to another. Of course, I'm all against this kind of narcissism of small differences, to saying, okay, now we are slightly different from you, and this is often a disease of the left, that you have this kind of but at the same time, I think there are some important questions that should not be simply forgotten or even forbidden to be discussed, because now we should all stick together against this enemy, because a certain way of the thinking in itself is already radical thing, and I think Slavoj wrote some beautiful pages on this. And we should, first of all, not stop thinking. Whatever we do, we should not stop thinking. But if thinking takes sometimes a form of a certain fight or polemic, so be it, but not, this kind of narcissism of small differences.
Okay, I'll take up two things. One is, Vanessa's question about the question of victims and victimization, victimhood in all this. I'll take just one aspect of it. I think also in these sexual harassment cases, these women were actually, yes, victims of a certain behavior. But being a victim, and I think this is a very important political lesson, is not enough for the politics. This is why all this situation is so ambiguous at this point. Because we want to see women as passive, not the agents, not sexual agents in any way, just on the receiving end of all these things, and we love the victims. We love the victims. Victimhood is not enough. One should proceed from that point of sheer victimization as a form of subjectivity to forming a certain political stance out of it. Loving the innocent victims is not enough as a stance for any fight. And there is a long history to this. And I will mention Frantz Fanon, who was the first post-colonial theorist before any post-colonial studies had ever started in 1952, who saw this point extremely well, that for blacks proclaiming that they are victims of the imperialism, white racism, etc., this is not a politics. This is some sort of beautiful soul. Like one should form a radical politics out of this. And okay, I will pick up the question about the revolution. What do we do after the revolution? Will this disappear after revolution? Again, with some skepticism about the way that the signifier revolution functions, and functions as as a sort of easy label or easy way out. We are all for revolution. We are not reformists. We are not just liberals. We want revolution. Huh? And there is this sentence in Orwell, which I love, because it's indicative of a certain position, which goes roughly like this. In every revolutionary opinion draws parts of its strength from the secret conviction that nothing can be changed. It's a very good sentence. It points to a certain libidinal underpinning of revolutionary talk, because we secretly believe that, well, nothing will change, and therefore we are safe to speak about revolution and radicality, which then stands in for our own incapacity for change, engaging in real action at this point, because we all await this big event of revolution and wonder what the hell will happen after the revolution. Will we have, how we organize a society after that? So there are many ways in which the signified revolution actually hinders, prevents radical politics. Okay, I stopped just with 2 comments.
Are you done, or are you going to start talking, Slavoj?
How do they say that some stupid song, cowboys' work is never done? No. Very briefly, no, don't be afraid. First, what both of you touched, this is so important about victimhood, because...
Thank you, that was great.
No, sorry, very briefly. Because I experienced the same problem of this false complicity of victims and public and mutual narcissistic satisfaction 25 years ago when there was a civil war in my country, although not in my part. And I participated, this is one of my formative experiences, I participated in some Hitchcock conference in San Francisco, I think. And a guy attacked me. How can you talk here about such a trivial thing like Alfred Hitchcock when your country is in flames? And I exploded back. Aha, you know, I was allowed just to play that role of, women are raped, villages are burning in my country. My answer was very simply, but you can talk, or what? You know, this idea that I was, in a very racist way even, identify with that. The second thing, I will connect this question to that of suffering and so on. The problem with me is that, the problem with suffering is that when you draw a certain, even libidinal enjoyment out of it. I will not lose time, we don't have it. Just, I advise you to do something. Go on YouTube and put Goebbels, Joseph, Total War speech from 43. It's an incredible document of excess of enjoyment in suffering. What he promises to Germans is not any final paradise victory. What he promises to Germans is, he says, do you want a total war? A war so total, with so much effort and suffering, that you cannot even imagine it. And the crowd shouts, oh yes, yes, we will it, and so on. So, you know, things are here extremely twisted. You cannot simply oppose suffering as with victimhood. I totally agree with Mladen and others that victimhood as such is not only not political agent, but it's like, didn't you notice how big media, they love victims in third world countries. The moment these victims organize themselves, they tend to disqualify them immediately, almost, you are a terrorist or whatever, you know. Everybody loves victims. So I totally agree with Mladen, and I'm mad at you that I didn't get this point before, that I wonder what will be now with all this, Rose McGowan and so on protesting, what will be the second act, you know? Will this be all? Me also. I read somewhere, I don't know, you told me if it's true or not, that even Monica Lewinsky now raised her voice. Me too. I was also victimized by Bill Clinton or whatever and so on. Okay, the first step, but then comes the much more difficult, crucial part that you as a victim should not get caught into perversely enjoying your victimhood. There is a whole industry today of victimhood. But very briefly, so there are others like alt-right and so on. I agree with, if I got it correctly, what you said, because let's be concrete here, alt-right, horror, and so on and so on. Well, one has to do more precise analysis. First, it's said how some alt-rightists, part of their neo-fascist project, no doubt, are making claims that almost no leftist, at least in institutional parties, is ready to do. For example, Steve Bannon. You know what he said as a reaction to Trump's tax reform plan? He said this is a horror, it privileges the rich. On the contrary, taxes should be raised to 45% for the rich. The second thing, we should really avoid what you, Mladen, last time. Said about this, yes, we have to be united, but at the same time, when we have now this alt-right rebellion, whatever you call it, the crucial point is, what did we, insofar as we all count ourselves as liberal progressive, what did we do wrong? Are we aware what scandal was Trump's election? Everybody thought he's a lost case. Where was the mistake here? And
you made him win.
Sorry?
You were the mistake.
You will explain this when we, the people, take power. You will have all the time in your gulag cell to write. No, sorry. But you know what I want? Just very briefly, don't be mad. I just wanted to add this, that now the scandal is what is Democratic Party doing now. Trump is doing his job of successfully ruining gradually Republican Party. No? The Democratic Party, what are they doing? All these stories about Russians meddling, of course they probably did, the way United States are doing all the time in foreign elections. But this was not the crucial factor. The crucial factor, it was clear, was the mistake, the totally wrong strategy, getting rid of Bernie Sanders of the left and so on. And all this obsession with Russian hackers and so on, it's just to prevent Republic. And so party from asking the key self-critical questions. And the real way to fight alt-right and Trump is to go on with this self-critical fight. If we don't do this, then if we will leave, as you wrote nicely, this to just guys like Jon Stewart, John Oliver, then we can have all the laugh at Trump, but he will keep winning, no?
So I know that you've really donated a lot of thought to this event, and we're very, very fortunate to have heard from all three of you. Shut up. Let me just wrap this up already. It's been like 2 hours too long. After my intro, it went downhill. So I want to say one thing. Thank you.
Cut her. That's good. Cut her.
I do want to say one thing that, you know, in terms of autobiographies, I've been shuttling between the so-called different destinations, which of course rigorously we do need to address, of sexual difference, like Hélène Cixous and others, and gender theory and trouble. So I would have liked maybe to ask for a more complicated relation to some of Judith Butler's work, though I understand that that's not always possible, but for the next time, the next round, should we re-invite you ever, that will be your punishment. Your sexuality will be to wear the mask of gender trouble. How's that? Is that a deal?
No, because I don't have sexuality at my age. No, the best description of the nonsense.
That's what they all say.
Of the nonsense of sexuality is, you know, the beautiful English joke when some lord in his park was doing, how do you call it, push-ups, no? And the butler comes and says, Did his lordship not notice that the lady has already left, you know?
All right, this lady is leaving. Thank you, everybody.